Welcome to Mindset, Mood and Movement, a systemic approach to human behavior, performance and well-being. Welcome. I am delighted to be joined by my guest, Ben Johnson. Now, Ben is an entrepreneur, teacher, a talker, a coach and a guide. So he's a really inspiring guide. He's a person who thinks very differently. And in fact, his business and his worldview is called peripheral thinking, which is going to be very helpful. Now, if you're a founder, if you're a thought leader, if you're making changes in the world, this is for you, because how we think defines almost everything that we do. It changes how we see the world and how we act. And Ben and I hope we're going to dig into the conversation really around thinking and thought, and I'm going to expand on that to some degree. Ben's got some amazing principles around lean mind and unlearning. So if you are a thought leader, if you are a leader in your business, this is for you. So welcome, Ben. Good to have you with me this morning.
Sal, pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Let's tuck in thinking. I remember reading about the distinction between thought and thinking, because we can kind of muddle those up, can't we? But I think it was David Bohm, the physicist, who's a great thought leader. He said that thought is in the past. It's very static, whereas thinking's in the present. It's very dynamic. And that's what we're alluding to today, isn't it? That thinking itself, that more dynamic process of how you do thinking, as opposed to more historical thought, is perhaps what we want to get to. So tell me your understanding of thinking, because you're all about peripheral thinking. Can you expand upon that concept for us a little bit more?
Yeah. No, it's very interesting hearing you frame it in that way, because a lot of the writing and talking that I do is under the umbrella of peripheral thinking. And I guess it's the name peripheral thinking came, which might be kind of relevant in terms of understanding this idea of thinking a little bit. The name peripheral thinking came from lots of these things do, actually just from registering a domain name about 6 years ago. Actually, the last company I'd run, which is a company called Free State, we used to host these dinners once a quarter, and 3 different speakers would be invited to come and offer a lens on a specific topic. So there'd be a set topic, 3 speakers offering a different lens on those. And my company was called Free State. The dinners were called Free Dinner. And, it was a sort of chance to kind of meet, connect, and sort of be inspired by other people's ideas a little bit. And they were really fantastic evenings. And about 6 years ago, I was curious about doing something similar as a kind of event format. And there was something resonant about the name peripheral thinking. And I'd registered the domain name and then promptly did absolutely nothing with it. I don't know if you've ever done anything similar. I think the number of domain names that I've owned and done nothing with definitely stretches out longer than my arm. Anyway, I'd registered this name, had done nothing with it. And then a few years ago was revisiting the idea of actually setting up a podcast. And it was like, I've got peripheral thinking. And the thing that I was really interested in, the reason I guess I'd continued holding on to the name, and it felt like a good place for a good home for the podcast, is I was really interested in the idea that, and this kind of plays out to thought, but actually, as with all of these things, what might originate or play out as thought, of course, we then see expressed into the world. And so coming out from the world before we come back to the thought bit, you'd probably be familiar with the idea that, cities are kind of regenerated often by artists, or, a city goes through, I know it's happening to Detroit at the moment, a once huge thriving city built on a really rich industrial past falls into huge disrepair because the money starts to leave. And what had been the underlying engine room of it, quite literally in the case of Detroit, sort of withers away, and you're kind of left with this husk of a city. And when you're left with the kind of husk of a city, it goes through a very, very long period of real poverty and decline and just sort of disrepair, essentially. But the thing that happens over time is people start to move in, often in a sort of cliched way, but often artists will move in. And the artists move in because it's cheap. And it's a good place to be and connect, and they can kind of work without the constraints that might otherwise be there. And because it's cheap, essentially. And what the artist does essentially is that they bring new ideas in. What great art is about really is experimenting, exploring with new ideas, with new thinking. And so in a sense, the city is regenerated from these outsides in. These new people come in with new ideas, they're championing new things, they're experimenting, they're playing on the margins a little bit. And the thing that's really kind of curious for me is how then a city regenerates in this way. So, the ideas that are on the margins, the thinking that are on the margins, and they are very much in the periphery, they become the thinking which shapes the mainstream tomorrow. So, in the same way that this life breathes through a city, I'm really curious about how the same process breathes through us, essentially. The ideas which are going to shape and inform our mainstream tomorrow, the things that we think are central tomorrow. This might be things which are sort of relevant, which feel just relevant to me, the micro of me. But equally, we live in times of real kind of considerable change, whether it's ecological, environmental, social, political, economic, huge changes. A lot of the things which have been extremely familiar for us over 50, 60 stroke 1,000 years, those things are being challenged. Those things are crumbling. And I'm really curious, in the same way a city works, the ideas which are going to shape and inform our mainstream tomorrow are just playing on the margins. They're playing on the periphery today. And so I'm really curious about how we create space for these ideas on the margins to start to infuse the mainstream. So how we kind of give space to the ideas on the periphery, the thinking on the periphery, so that it starts to weave in to kind of shape and inform how we choose to live our lives today. So that's a very long and kind of rambling city-wide to personal-wide kind of view about this idea behind peripheral thinking.
I like it. Really, really nice. It's such an interesting example you gave with Detroit, and of course the demise of the city, the falling away. Very much, if we're to use language like entropy, when everything falls away, which is thermodynamics, the ending of something. But of course, life is negentropy, which is where things regenerate and it brings new things to it. I'm really intrigued because you're an entrepreneur, you're a business guy, you're a super intelligent thinker, and I like to work a lot in the thinking space as well as the human space. And we can get very myopic, is what I see, is particularly with the way we act, think, and run our lives and our businesses. And the myopic view is because it's only 3 generations, maybe 4. The whole world was different. We dial back to probably my grandparents, great-grandparents era. There were barely any cars around, probably sub 2 billion people on the planet, no computers. Culture was very, very different. Fast forward 3-4 generations, the physiology of the human system hasn't changed much. The neurology, the brain, we know most things hasn't really changed probably in about, 100,000 years, but it's evolved very slowly. Yet culture, business, thinking, technology, of course, has really accelerated. And I'm wondering how you see this balance, because, if we're taking, in some ways, we're fast forwarding at the moment. Like the old videos we used to scrub really fast forward. Our culture's moving forward so quickly. Is our thinking keeping up with pace? And I don't know if it is. I think the leading edge thinkers are, but I think for the masses, we are still biologically driven. We know our brain is wired to stay safe. We know about status quo bias and all these things that from psychology, which mean we like to stay as we are. But in a world that's moving fast, you need to move with it as opposed to resist it. Now, how is this playing out? Because I know you've run different businesses and you work with business people of all different natures. How is this playing out in the thinking processes that you're seeing, perhaps in yourself and the people you're working with?
I mean, it's kind of interesting. I think you're absolutely right. And you know a huge amount about this, that the externally things feel like they are going much faster. And in many respects, they are going much faster. A world which is hooked and anchored to technological change, of course, is subject to the rate of technological change. And the things like Moore's law and whatnot, we know these things increase in speed. Technology is increasing in speed, increasing in capacity. And this, of course, can lend a feeling, which is both real and unreal, of things speeding up. I was actually on a Buddhist retreat last year, and one of the teachers was talking about, who knows actually how they kind of know this, but the spirit of it kind of makes sense to me, which is, if you thought yourself back to the 16th century version of yourself, let alone to the version of yourself who was alive in the time of the Buddha, so 2,500, 3,000 years ago, but even just your 16th century version of yourself, that you would be exposed to the same amount of information, data, sensory input over what would take a year in your 16th century version of yourself we now experience in an hour, right? So we are basically bombarded with information and stimulus and data and things which seem to demand a continual response, like in this sort of ever increasing speed. So like over this idea of an hour versus what we used to experience over a year. And so to your point, to your question there, the conversation around, how do we respond? Do we respond? How do we respond? How do we deal with, how does our thinking respond to this? And in a sense, I think one of the things I'm really curious about is to help people make a distinction between the things that do move really quickly and the things that don't move really quickly. And actually, it's quite a reassuring place, and also quite a sort of strategically important place, I might say, from the point of view of running a company, to work out, well, what are the things which actually change really, really slowly, right? So the things around the human condition, like you point out, this changes really, really slowly. The values that we hold, they might change really, really slowly. And so actually, the more time that we can start to distinguish between the things which do change really slowly and the things which do change really fast, and so that we can start to orientate our action, orientate the work of our company, orientate how we work much more to the really, really slow. Because also that helps us step out of the continual chase that comes by being too hooked to the things that change really, really fast, of course, over which we also have absolutely no control. So I'm really interested in not how do I keep up, how does thinking keep up, but actually how can I slow down? While everything else gets faster and faster and faster and faster, what can I do to slow down? What can I do to come back to the point from which things change extremely slowly? And how can I use this as a sort of personal, strategic, competitive advantage? One little story which reinforces that. I don't know if you know the podcast and blog Farnham Street by a guy called Shane Parrish, who's kind of written a huge amount about thinking. He'll be a kind of very interesting person to look at. But I remember on one, he has a newsletter which comes out once a week, and I know the letter from a few weeks ago was talking about a similar idea. This idea about focusing on things which change very slowly as opposed to being too hooked to things which change very quickly. And actually, the example that he gave in support of this same idea was actually Jeff Bezos. Now, whatever your view of Jeff Bezos, actually, a lot of what he was talking about in terms of how you run Amazon, which obviously is a tech business and whatever, but you would look at that, it would be easy to look at a tech business and go, well, that's all about what changes really, really quickly. But actually, what he was always really keen to get the teams to focus on is, no, what are the things which change very, very slowly? What can we be surer about 10 years from now? Because let's focus our efforts and our activities on the things we can be surer about in 10 years' time, rather than trying to guess, anticipate, imagine what might be the case in 10 years. So focusing on what changes very slowly feels to me a really important and, like I said, quite a reassuring and nourishing place to come back to.
Yeah, such an interesting point. In many ways, we're talking, in some ways, paradox. And I know the Eastern masters were all about paradox and Zen. Obviously, the koans are paradoxical. I've studied a small amount of Buddhism myself, but paradox is really interesting because it's quite a difficult mind state, let's say, for the human mind. It's very difficult. We like absolutes. We like black and white thinking. Certainly in the West, we're brought up on either or thinking, Socratic thinking, to give it technical language. In the East, we have more of a both and thinking, which I think is, and I was lucky to have masters who trained me in this field, and I can't hold it all the time, but I open my mind as much as I can to that both and thinking, which is, of course, paradox. What's remaining? What is steady? And what's super fast? And how does one be with that? For me, the first thing is the sheer awareness that this is actually how life actually works. The truth of it, they're very steady forces and they're very fast forces. I'm a metaphor person because I know it uses whole brain, and I imagine like the tectonic plates of the earth. They're slow, heavy forces that are, they move over eons, whereas the high winds up in the stratosphere, they're super fast. And maybe we're actually mirroring that kind of way of the earth, that the tectonic plates are part of our psyche to some degree. And yet we're also got our heads in the clouds, literally, in the stratosphere of 100-mile-an-hour winds where it's all going so fast. Now, These are all kind of principles and theories. I want to get into. We've spoken about unlearning. Now, unlearning is an interesting thing. I'm a learner, and you're a teacher. I'm an educator as well. I cannot not stop learning. I literally love it. In fact, I remember learning that philosophy was the love of knowledge years ago. That wow, this is interesting. I love learning because it makes you feel fresh and vital and energized, and it's an utter privilege that we can learn. That's my view. But actually, you have an interesting view about learning also needs to be unlearning. Now, perhaps you could expand on your worldview of unlearning and how that takes shape.
Yeah, thank you for that prompt. And I guess my first point to what I'm saying. So, like you, I also have a real love of learning, a real love of yeah. So I have the reason I was just searching for my words, so I was just trying to find the right way into it, actually, because I have the same as you, a real love of learning. So I'm a reader, right? Or have traditionally always been a reader. Love new books, would eat books, or not quite literally, but would always be acquiring books, right? And there's a few different kind of responses to this question about what unlearning is about. Because on the one hand, actually, one of the things I came to realize in a way was I do have, well, I think learning anyway, if we is a primal thing because it talks to our need to evolve, it talks to our need to be developing. Actually, this picks up on the question conversation we were having just before around. I think that we have a continual love of learning, a need to keep learning, a need to keep evolving is part of our human condition. That doesn't necessarily need to kind of feed into the continual change point, but I think that we have a kind of love of learning, and I'm the same. But I think in a way, and there is also a shadow side. Well, certainly there was for me in a sense, right? So I think in a way, hid behind constantly acquiring knowledge as a safety scaffold, in a sense. It's kind of somewhere at its heart was a real primal need to learn and a love of learning. But also then it's where the learning just becomes knowledge, and knowledge becomes ego, and it becomes safety, and it's like I know something, I'm solid, I'm big, I'm safe, I'm tall, by somehow defined by this weight of things that I know. And about sort of 5 years ago, I actually stopped reading non-fiction books pretty much, although I have a podcast, and so quite often speaking to people on there who have written a book, and I will often read their books as part of that journey. But actually, I really completely changed the amount of nonfiction that I was reading, because I was sort of feeling like I wasn't really sure what my motivation was. Actually, I'd come to question that a little bit. So there's one little nod there around this idea of unlearning. Is this, yes, learning is important. Yes, learning speaks to our need to evolve, but it's like in service of what? And for me, there was a little bit of a thing, I think, where my ego was starting to identify with the amount of things that I knew, and it was somehow it was a point of safety. And so stepping out of that in a way kind of felt important. And stepping out of that, and actually, rather than spending my time reading non-fiction books, actually, I now spend almost all my time reading fiction, because the love of story, essentially. And we've sort of touched on this idea of kind of worldviews being important, the counterweight to behavior. And story, are the kind of narrative. It's learning the art of narrative, and narrative, of course, is how we make sense of the world. So the one thing, this thing around kind of unlearning, was recognizing on the one hand that maybe there was an ego defense thing in trying to acquire more knowledge, and to being known as the person who knows things, right? And so kind of like actually starting to let that go a little bit, and to be able to dance a little bit more often with not knowing things, was quite a liberating exercise for me. The other thing around that, which maybe is an extension of it, I think, particularly in the context that you raise it, one of the projects that I am putting together is a thing called the Unlearning Academy. And this specifically is about the idea that actually quite often when we get to a place of stuckness, which lots of us will feel, whether it's in the running of our companies or whatever it might be. I know when I was running my last company, which I ran for over 15 years, every about 5 years, we would hit a stuckness point. And obviously that's not a technical term. Maybe the stuckness is felt by a kind of plateauing in sales. Maybe a stuckness is felt by dysfunction in the team, or a dysfunction in myself, or in how we as the kind of leaders and owners of the business felt. But really, we'd feel this, every 5 years, this kind of need, and just to reconnect a little bit to who we are, and reconnect a little bit to the work that we wanted to do, and reconnect a little bit to what the expectations of the market would be. And so this kind of need to re-find a connection, I think for me is often about certainly my habit, my tendency through my life had always been to acquire new things, acquire new knowledge in order to solve that a little bit. And what I've sort of come to sort of experiment a little bit more is actually maybe the task, maybe the art is letting go of things to refine that connection, to unlearn things, to refine that connection. And this sort of came up a little bit in work that I was doing with a client of mine in some of the coaching work I do. He had been a chief executive of a sort of big, relatively big company, many thousands of employees, sort of 10 locations around the world. He'd had to leave that role because of what they called burnout, which he understood was then an inability, essentially, just to continue working in that way, to an inability, essentially, to keep playing out the story that he was playing out. And one of the things that he noticed is to get to the top of an organization like that, to get to the top of any organization, you probably, you're able to look at a system and work out how to navigate to the top of that system. The system might be the company, the system might be the market at large. But this ability to look at it and navigate how to the top and then implement that, to act on it. But the thing that what he had come to kind of realize and recognize a little bit was that all of the sort of skills and attributes and understanding and story that he had that allowed him to do that, he got to a point in his life where all of a sudden those things were no longer the things which allowed him to thrive, to work well. And so there's a need to unlearn, actually, a lot of the things that I've acquired, to unlearn a lot of the habits I have, to unlearn a lot of the stories that I tell about how I go about doing the work that I do. And so I'm kind of really interested in this process. How do I kind of unlearn? How do I practice this idea of letting go so that I'm able to simplify the world of noise in which I operate, in which I exist, so that I can sort of get back to maybe like a truer sense, a truer sort of place of source, really, the place where actually my kind of natural creativity is free to flow. And so for me, refinding that place is a process of letting go. Refinding that place is actually at its heart a process of unlearning.
Yeah, really, really nice, really succinct, and it makes me think of there's an old there's a saying from the NLP field. It was kind of, as all NLP was, kind of pulled together from different fields. Alfred Sisibsky back in the 30s, but the saying goes like this: whether we want to attribute to this guy or this guy, there's the map and the territory. And it's used in different fields, but the map is not the territory. But more interesting, what you're saying here is like you've got to the edge of your map, and if your mental map, and we call them mental models in psychology, if your mental model is to how to see the system work, the environment, the sales process, whatever it is, and suddenly you've got to the edge of your map. The old saying in coaches, what got you here won't get you there. The problem that we have is that we use the same map. Like, okay, how do I figure out burnout? How do I figure out evolution of my company or evolution of my psyche? We often go back and look at what we've done because it's just how we're wired, right? We're wired to look at the data in our mind and go, what do I know? And I'll apply that. The problem with that is, of course, it keeps you stuck in a certain sphere. And if you need to step out of that sphere, it's interesting, Ben, I coached someone recently around this, and we had to work on mindset, and we chose archetypal mindsets, and they were, the knowledge, they were the leader, and they knew all this stuff. And it was not a dissimilar situation. And I said, okay, so the whole situation you now need to do is a whole lot different. Everything's different in you, your actions, and your organization. What are you going to do? So we chose an archetype, and we chose the archetype of the explorer. Now, of course, the explorer is someone who might, back in the day would have got on a boat, and maybe now we use a plane or spaceship, but we'll get on some form of craft and travel somewhere. We don't know where we're going. And I think this is the distinction. I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know what climate change looks like, or I don't know how AI is going to affect my industry. But what I do know are certain things. And if we use the explorer mindset, you have a compass, which for me, if for an individual, that's having an internal moral compass, ethical compass, a frame of reference. Like, how do I know I'm on the right trajectory? Because I don't know where I'm going, but I need the right trajectory. And you need a set of skills. Like, if you're going to sail a boat, you need to know how to sail. But if you can sail and you have a compass, you can find new things. The problem that we have is, of course, we often are metaphorically driving around the same route in our known culture and keep repeating what we're doing. And of course, repeating stuff which is unhelpful can lead to burnout or disenchantment. It can also fail companies because they come to the end of their cycle, and unless they refresh, they fail. So yeah, unlearning is really interesting, isn't it? I was reading some good Buddhist work recently, and of course I'm from a yoga background as well, and a lot of that is letting go of what you think you are, all the kind of conceptual parts, and being more with the essence, which is what you've alluded to, which is a really lovely thing, isn't it? It's a really lovely kind of psychology and state of mind to come to, because if you're pure essence, like you have availability to all things, if you allow it to come, it's much more emergent. And there is a theory in coaching and psychology called emergent properties, that things come up, as opposed to the more directive, like, I know what to do, I will do this. And again, we're back to paradox, aren't we, Ben? Where we've got this tussle or that interplay between the unknown and the known, or the steady and the moving fast. And actually, if we think about what we're talking here, really how you view the world is probably more important than what you can do in it. Your skills are useful, of course, and we need skills, but how you view the world is probably the superpower that we probably need more now. Now, you spoke, so we've spoken as well about another layer of your thinking and the work you're doing, and it's called lean mind. And I was really intrigued. I love that statement, lean mind. I'd like to understand it more for myself, of course. I'd like to learn, as we've already covered, but in terms for our listener, what is lean mind? Explain more, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm sort of half chuckling to myself because I'm really good at coming up with names. And then so like starting things, coming up with names, that's all totally in my sort of sweet spot of most capable zone, right? And but then actually kind of really sort of developing things out, because also like I have a habit of sort of easily distracted, a mind which doesn't sort of settle on things. So I chuckles myself when you sort of asking the question around what is lean mind. In a sense, kind of lean mind talks to an amalgam of all of the things in a way that I've picked up and sort of practiced and learned and not learned over the years. And I guess one sort of way into it, you were just talking before this question around some of the paradox and the need to let go and sort of come back to this idea of the essence. And a lot of like like you also, I've studied a lot of Buddhism. And so some of it, of course, is super esoteric and very difficult to understand, and intentionally so, as you made reference to earlier in the Zen tradition, the whole thing around koans. They're basically supposed to be paradox which can't be understood. And okay, so that sounds quirky and fun, to particularly to our Western mind, but also in many ways completely useless. It's like, okay, what sound does a one clapping? What is the one hand clapping? What sound does one hand clapping make? Like, well, I've no idea what sound it makes. But anyway, yeah, of course, so lots in Buddhism is very esoteric and difficult to understand. But this principle of how you let go and sort of coming back to an idea of the kind of essence, in a sense, is one of the ideas which informs this endeavor around lean mind. And one little sort of qualification on that, I remember working with a teacher of mine, and this is a few years ago now, and it was coming up to the end. It was like a sort of December time or something. And I remember we were talking about intention. And for me, this also is another important part of lean mind. The clarity of intention and orientation. Like, what direction am I traveling in? And like you made reference to this just before. For me, this is, am I clear about my intention? Am I clear about the orientation? Am I clear around what is important to me? Am I clear around the direction that I want to be heading in? And, actually this, in a sense, well, certainly in a lot of Buddhist teaching, that is also a kind of foundational idea that intention, everything flows from intention. And so it's like, what is my intention in any given moment? And for me, I'm really curious about, what is my intention in terms of my work? What is my orientation? What is my direction of travel, we might say? Because that then sets a direction. And if I'm not really clear around that, then I'm likely to be buffeted by the winds. I'm likely to be buffeted by technology and AI and the changing fads and all of these sorts of things. So, in a sense, Lean Mind does start from this idea of clarity of intention, clarity of orientation. And when I have those things, in a sense, I can then put them down and I can then come back to dealing with the immediate, but I've got to have those things in place. This other idea around kind of lean mind is, which I just was going to pick up on, was this idea of letting go. And I was talking about spending time with a teacher. It was December time, and we were talking about intention, which I also just expanded on, why this is a foundational thing. But we were talking about my intentions for the year coming. And I said something along the lines of, my intention for the next year is an intention to let go. And to which my teacher very skillfully said to me, it's not about letting go. It's about understanding where you're holding. And so the work, the practice, the idea is not letting go. It's like, where actually am I holding? And when I understand where I'm holding and I bring awareness to where I'm holding, and of course, what do we mean by this? We might be holding on to ideas that we have. We might be holding on to stories that we tell. We might be holding on to beliefs that maybe don't serve us. We might be holding on to relationships which don't work for us. And of course, these things are true in the doing of our work, and they're true in the living of our lives more generally, because actually there is no real distinction between those things. We might put things into a work bucket or a rest of life bucket, but we're the common denominator in that. And so this kind of idea of being able to let go, to being able to kind of return back to some idea of essence, some idea of a creative adaptability is how I like to think of it. How is it that I can sort of roll with the waves of my work? How is it that I can roll with the waves of my life? And in a sense, what are the components, the characteristics of that? Yes, it's really important to have clarity of intention, clarity of orientation, that I know the direction that I'm traveling in. And it's important for me personally that is anchored, that is hooked far in the distance. This isn't about what's happening now. It's not about a resolution for the year. It's about, almost like, I often think about this in terms of the running companies. If we were trying to run a company which we wanted to thrive for 100 years, what decisions would we make differently about what we were doing? We would make many things. And actually, it lends a space, it lends a perspective. So for me, this idea of lean mind does start with intention and orientation. And then it comes back to think, okay, so what am I holding on to? What are the stories, ideas, beliefs, habits, people, relationships, whatever it might be, clients, projects? What am I holding on to actually, which no longer serves me? And when I bring some awareness to this thing of holding on, it lessens the grip, it lessens the hold. And this is an important part of the simplifying, the letting things go idea. This kind of idea that we are unlearning, like we were talking about before, is in this idea of kind of understanding where am I kind of holding on. So intention orientation. So I'm thinking far into the distance, which allows me to come back to the day to day, comes back to the immediate. Hold the long-term plan, the long-term vision in my mind, the long-term intention, the long-term orientation, then just come back to, okay, so what now? What here? What now? And then I can sort of start to experiment and explore around, okay, so where am I holding on? What am I holding on to which no longer serves me? Why am I holding on to that? And in the holding on to that, I kind of lessen the grip of it slightly. And so then I'm simplifying the stuff of my life. In the Buddhist language, we might call that renouncing. But in the context of what we're talking about, it's like, that is an act of unlearning. Because this is all for me then about being able to then sort of store up my own, be aware of and store up my own creative capability. There's an economist who I like, a little bit radical, a bit too radical for many, a Greek guy called Yanis Varoufakis. And he has a brilliant line, which is, if you think about a kind of refugee, essentially, this is a lesson that his dad had taught him. Because he was talking about the importance of learning, actually. But also via the lens of whether you acquire things or you don't acquire things or whatever it might be. And he was saying, look, his dad saying to him, look, this actually, imagine you are a refugee and you are, you're on a ship, you're basically forced to travel to kind of lands far away. And you are walking down the gangplank of the new kind of lands that you've arrived in. You arrive with yourself, only with yourself, family aside. You arrive only with your capabilities. You arrive only with your ability to respond, to adapt, to react, to go. And for me, this is about you arrive with your ability to respond creatively. And so for me, what I'm interested in is how can I remove as much of the noise as possible? And a kind of one huge big caveat on all of this. This, of course, all sounds wonderful. And the reality, of course, is it's really effing hard, to excuse my language, because the stuff of life gets in the way. But this idea of how is it that I can come back to a place, as the refugee might, arrives in a place with nothing other than their ability to respond, their ability to adapt, their ability to kind of roll with the stuff of the life, and to meet that with contribution, to meet that with the commitment, to meet that. And for me, that is what the essence of creativity is about. And so I'm kind of interested in how do I kind of remove as much of the noise as possible so that I'm kind of give myself the best chance as possible, which sometimes I can do, and most of the time I can't, of course. But it's some to give myself, to as much as often as possible to ensure the conditions are right and to give myself the chance of being able to respond in the most creative way.
That's such an eloquent description. And I was really struck by that. I was really struck by this, but what you were saying about unlearning and lean mind and about how we can think and get cleaner, less baggage, less heavy weight so we can be lean and have, like you said, if you arrived at a port as a refugee and you just had your capabilities, you had your spirit, you had your ethics, you had, everything that you bring as a human, you are in many ways light, so light, isn't it? And you are free to create. In the domain I work, a lot of the time that baggage is internal, and that's a psychological holding on. And the one thing I see particularly for high performing people, founders and business owners, people who've done well, exports people who have all who I've coached, is the identity, or rather their connection to their identity with said baggage, is where we need to do the work. Because if someone identifies with, I'm super successful, I'm very intelligent, and I know someone, he had a media business, and then he got sold, and he said to me, I don't know who I am. I literally don't know who I am without my business title. And I was like, wow, isn't that interesting? You've got such a strong identification with your business title as opposed to you as the man, just the human that you are. And we have to do a lot of work of really letting that go, because the inherent meaning for this person was that mattered so much. It was like, it's mine. I identify with it. So my thing, Ben, that I see is an over-identification with either our attributes, our intelligence, our stuff, if you're super successful financially, and we overly identify with that as we think it's part of us rather than an expression of what we've been able to do. And I really find it interesting when you, in fitness training, I really like all kinds of fitness training. I do a lot of it myself. But when you strip it back, I do some stuff which is based on strongman principles, like pushing a heavy thing along a room or the road and pulling a heavy thing. It doesn't get more basic than that. You don't have to be doing technical Olympic lifting to have a strong body by simply pushing a heavy sled or pulling a heavy sled. You will work most of your body. And in many ways, we load up our metaphorical sled, certainly as leaders or founders, with all this stuff, this emotional narrative, identity narrative, when actually, if we can, empty that stuff and just push the sled, it's kind of cleaner and leaner. So I love what you're proposing there with the lean mind principle. And one thing I want to speak to, that many people listening to this podcast that all want to understand how to perform better, how to perform in their personal and their professional life. And, the one thing I hear with so many people is the inability to focus. Now, you said it earlier on in our conversation about that there's so many distractions now compared to, say, the 1700s. Like the data coming in is just preposterous, and we just assume it's normal. The ability to focus is not a new issue, though. I studied with a yoga master, and he talks about this idea called ekagrata, which is single-focused awareness. And they used to talk about the monkey mind in yoga, like jumping all over the place. And actually, it's more of this is not a new phenomenon. It's probably an accelerated phenomenon or amplified, but it's not a new phenomenon. So I think if we struggle to focus, it's like that's the human mind. And I don't know about you, Ben, but when I went to school, no one gave me mind training. But nobody. They told me what to think in geography and maths and all that nonsense. which hasn't really helped me. Um, I learned a lot as an adult, and I learned a lot going through, particularly other arts like the Eastern arts. I've really understood the self and how to think. And I do wonder that there's such a need for this now, that we need to know how to think, not what to think, but how to think in a world that's a very different landscape. How you come at it, as you've already said, your intentionality is probably what's going to set you apart from the person who can't disidentify with who they think they were and how great they are. With that in mind, have you got an example of what you might do with someone who has that particular problem? They're overly identified with their title or their success, and yet you say, okay, let's bring in this principle out, letting go of lean mind. Have you got an example of someone you've worked with that you've been able to do this with?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think actually, I was just reading something this morning about it was a newsletter that somebody else writes, and it was the subject was how do I know, this person was writing, and it was like, how do I know what I know. I mean, she was articulating it better than that, but it's kind of this interesting point, like you're talking about. Yeah, we're not taught to at school. We're not taught to to reflect. We're not taught to be able to sort of distill. We're not taught, I think, a lot, and this is in a way a lot of what your work is about also. Like, in a sense, the body often knows, doesn't it? So it's like, actually, how do I know what I know? Is like, okay, really, the body as barometer, right? In my body, I kind of know if I'm reacting to something or not reacting to something. In my body, I know if things resonate or are resonant and or kind of make sense or right for me. And in a way, the problem that you sort of spoke to, which is identifying with title, identifying with label, identifying with the stuff of my life, and of course that is partly internal. Or well, it starts internally. It starts in mental emotional baggage, but particularly for people like I know, also true a little bit for my own case, people who are running companies. In a way, we create the company. The company becomes ever more complex because it's just, in a sense, an expression of all of that baggage in our mind. And I think, coming to an awareness of that is an important thing to getting a little bit of space from it. But very kind of sort of specifically in terms of the kind of identifying with label, identifying with those things. I think for me that is where people often just need help. I mean, it sounds. We started this conversation talking about this idea of peripheral thinking, and one of the things around peripheral thinking is, of course, what is peripheral to one person is already mainstream to another. And so, kind of recognizing and appreciate that actually everyone is at a different point on that sort of spectrum, right? And so, the reason I say that is oftentimes I find if people are really identified with the kind of title, it's because they've lost connection with some things which would then be peripheral for them are things around value, things around values, things about orientation, things about intention, as well as maybe some very real things like you also do, teach really well. Actually, just come back to the body. Go push a heavy sled. Go pull a heavy sled. Practice sitting down quietly. Like, I was actually working with helping again in some of the coaching work I do with somebody just the other week, and it was less about him having identified with with a sort of specific role or title. I can talk about my own experience of that in a moment. But it's more about, like, I was asking him to sort of articulate a lot of discontent in his sort of life at the moment, and I was asking him to sort of articulate actually what it was that he was kind of wanting, right? So what were the feelings he wanted? And it was some various exercises that we were doing. And he was talking, it came to me writing, and I'm very interested in using writing as a way of kind of drawing out what's kind of really going on for people. And he came to be writing about these ideas of space and freedom, right? And he was sort of kept talking about it, and I was like, okay. So then I started saying to him, so when in your life now do you experience space and freedom? Or I can't remember the exact two words, versions of those. And he said, never. It's like, never. And there's probably truth and not truth in that. Of course, like in some form, he can't sort of identify because he always sort of feels like he said, like, so for him, he does do a lot of exercise, right? But it's the lens with which he does exercise, which is maybe the thing which then needs work, right? He is very active. He's very fit. He runs a lot. But clearly that running is from a place of grinding somewhat. Do you know what I mean? It's not from a place of freedom. It's not from a place of clarity, of calm. So working with the client, and he really wanting, feeling that the solution to the problem that he is feeling now, the solution to the discontent that he's feeling, is that some point in the future he wants to feel sort of freedom. He wants to feel some, more spacious. He wants to feel more calm. And so I was just asking him to try and sort of explore where those, where those things might be present now. And for him, they're kind of not present at all, even when he's doing things like running, which we might say it's a good way to get into the body, but it's just a reminder that how I do everything is the important thing. Yes, it's important to do exercise. Yes, it's important, whatever the thing is, but how I do it is clearly important. So if I'm coming at my exercise as this grinding with the same sort of story, in a sense, that I'm coming at everything else, then I'm not going to feel any spaciousness in it. I'm not going to feel any calm in it. I'm not going to feel any freedom in it. And so kind of helping him sort of shine a lens a little bit on how he is doing what he's doing is a way of helping him find some space from it, is one thing around that. But this thing generally around the kind of label. So from my own experience, the kind of over identifying with a title, there was probably pretty close to 10 years, I would say, from a point in which I was running my company, where I had been running it at that point for about sort of 6 or 7 years or so. It was the first time I had a thought that maybe my work in that company was done. But it was really fully about another 8 years or so before I had actually extricated myself from the company. And I think part of the reason that I struggled with that for so long, and I wouldn't have known that I was necessarily struggling with it for a long time. I was looking back, I can see I was struggling with it, but I wouldn't have necessarily known I was sort of struggling with it. I may not have said that as much if you'd asked me at the time. But I think part of the reason that I really struggled with it is I wasn't really sure who I would be or what I was if I wasn't the managing director, if I wasn't the co-founder of that company. Even though from a values point of view, there was a disconnect between what I was doing and what I wanted to be doing. These things were increasingly out of alignment. But this idea then of kind of identifying with the label, identifying with the title, it's a thing of safety. It's a thing of security. We're kind of projecting all of those things on. And it feels like if those things go away, then what am I? What am I left with? What's kind of left behind? And like I said, the reason I sort of share that is it was a long time for me before I got to a point where I was able to kind of extricate myself and to get out. And I'd wanted that for a long time. But actually, the most emotionally challenging point was, so my company, actually, we were fortunate. We'd been able to sell the company to a bigger company, and I'd been bought out. My business partner, who'd wanted to carry on anyway, became a partner in the other firm. So it was all kind of worked out well for everybody. But because it basically had been bought by a bigger company, there was a point where my email was turned off, right? So one morning I wake up and there's no email, right? Now, it's a really weird thing. So, like, obviously, I had wanted to extricate myself from the company for a really long time. But then on the day when I wake up and there is nothing, actually was incredibly destabilizing. The most destabilizing day of all. And a lot of what that is about, of course, is that the kind of the familiarity was gone. And so, I really very strongly identified with being the managing director, with being the co-founder, with being the person who was organized and attuned to constantly be looking for the challenges, constantly be looking for the sort of shit that might be coming down the road, which was going to somehow be some sort of existential threat to the survival of the company and by extension me. So the identifying with that is really deep rooted, very, very deeply ingrained. And it took, in a way, the shock of me, in a very felt sense, of one day being confronted by nothing to realize how much of that stuff, how much of that story had been there before that. And so in answer to the question, how do I kind of help people? I don't get to that now. Not really in a very sophisticated way, to be perfectly honest. I think to understand that, it is very easy to be too identified with that. And to, so I guess the gentle orientation, the movement, if I can see that in others, which of course is true for many, probably an understanding that maybe they've come too far away from themselves a little bit. And so just the kind of gentle inviting them back to understanding who they are, understanding who it is that actually, in a way, whatever the truth of this or not, who in a way they are wanting to be, who in a way they are born to be. So this comes back to the kind of the natural skills, the attributes, helping them to re-find that person, like we were talking about before, with the refugee, the person who arrives with their capabilities, their interests, their energy, their spirit, helping them refine that, as well as kind of shining a light on where they might be holding on a little bit tight to an idea of a label or an idea of a role. And so just gently work between those two things, bring them back. What are the, coming back to that point of capability, coming back to the point of intentional orientation, and actually rebuilding from there. Because if I rebuild my work from there, I rebuild my company from there. Actually, we're building an organization, a work of much, much more resilience.
Wise words. That's all I got to say. Come back to self, right? Come back to self. It's kind of drop off those identities, wake up. That's, the great old, the Buddhist, the Zens, all the masters will just kind of look at you sternly and say, wake up. They just say, wake up. But yes, wake up. It's so interesting, isn't it? So I, like you, studied Eastern arts. And when I think about, when I do a meditation, sometimes I do visualization ones, sometimes I do a quiet mind. There's various ones that I've learned, and the first ones I just feel are appropriate. And sometimes I just can't do them very well. But when I feel that sense of like, oh, this is interesting, this story that I have about myself today, maybe it's a good one, maybe it's a negative one, but it's a story. It's this sort of flowing thing. Whereas if I sit very, very quietly, I have the analogy. I have dived in the past, as in scuba dive. It's like when you go beneath the surface of the water, which is often chaotic, waves just splashing about, it's all over. If you drop down beneath, you're like, oh, this is nice. This is really calm and holding and steady, and it's a real beautiful feeling. Whereas up on the surface, it's chaos. And a lot of the time, the surface of our mind is where we're operating from, as opposed to the deeper part. Ben, lean mind, unlearning. I mean, I'm sold. It feels like an absolute, a prudent, appropriate, and absolute necessary thing that we need to do as individuals, but definitely need to do as leaders or founders in a world where we're looking at a huge, huge change, an accelerated change. And it's far better to have the right resources in place. Like you said, anchor into those steadies. What are those long-term remainers, whether values, human connection, whatever those pieces are, and what do I do with the fast-moving stuff? And I love the principle of lean mind and unlearning. I know you got some ways that people can work with you. So what I'm going to do, rather than a long-winded thing, we're going to put it in the show notes, because I know you've got various opportunities how to connect with Ben. If lean mind is something you think, yeah, I'm just going to need to lean up and learn, then we'll put Ben's details in the show notes. Peripheral thinking, I think you're right. We have this gift, don't we? We can think. It's just such a powerful tool, and a thought is such a powerful thing. You plant a seed in someone's mind, and it can grow, and that can grow into a beautiful tree of wonder and knowledge and inquiry. And it could be also a weed, like an ivy, which consumes you like a thought virus. And a lot of us have thought viruses as well. So I guess it's like, if you're the gardener of your mind, take care of what you're planting and what you need to clean out. Amazing. Ben, thank you for your thoughts. I hope, my dear listener, that there is much to pull out from that and really understand. I say this every time. Do what I do with podcasts. If you heard this and you grab some bits, go back, scrub through, find the bit that really stood out to you, that resonated, and you might need that, you might really benefit, and go put it into practice. And of course, let us know what happens if you do. So until the next time, stay lean, unlearn, and I'll speak to you on the next one. Take care. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe. And if a friend would benefit from hearing this, do send it on to them as well. If you would like to get in touch yourself, then you can go to my website, which is saljeffreys.com, spelled SALJEFFERIES, saljeffreys.com. Hit the Get in Touch link, and there you can send me a direct message. If you'd like to go one step further and learn whether coaching can help you overcome a challenge or a block in your life, then do reach out and I offer a call where we can discuss how this may be able to help you. Until the next time, take care.